So far we have looked at approaches to risky behaviors or understanding or conceptualizing risky behaviors. And these approaches are extremely important because I think for an adult mind, it is very difficult to comprehend why, despite obvious negative effects, that adolescents continue to engage in these risky behaviors. So I think it is these understanding these approaches are not only important from a conceptualization point of view, but also from an empathy point of view. As adults, I think it will help us perhaps see adolescents' world from their point of view and maybe empathize better with them. Now, having looked at some of these approaches, I think we should now move into the next phase, which is about understanding the nature of these risky behaviors and the details of each of those, particularly amongst adolescents and youth in Indian context. So I'm going to now take you through some of the very common examples of risky behaviors that adolescents and youth in India engage in. And this list by no way is an exhaustive list, but merely an illustrative list. And I'm sure that there are many other risky behaviors that adolescents engage. But this is just to give you an overview of what the literature says. Also, some of the risky behaviors that I'm going to talk about are most commonly reported risky behaviors in the literature. Let's start with something as commonly found as road accidents. Yeah, it's a very common experience for all of us, perhaps, to walk or to drive on a road, whereby you will see typically, a bunch of young men riding motorcycles without wearing a helmet and driving in a very, very rash manner, laughing, giggling, playing loud music, perhaps, and one fails to understand what is it that they can't see, which we can see. But I think so far we have already talked about how the adolescent world and the brain works and why is it that they are not able to see some things that perhaps we can see, or how the positive advantages of risky behaviors are far more luring and impressionable than the negative consequences. You can see some of the NCRB data being cited here, which talks about how the 2011 data talks about 31.3% of the road traffic deaths are seen among the age group of 15 to 29, and two-thirds of the road traffic injury deaths are reported in the age group of 15 to 44. So adolescents are very, very vulnerable to this risky behavior. Now, if we were to move to the next form of risky behaviors that adolescents commonly engage in, and media also talks a lot about it, which is use of substances. And these could be, gateway substances, such as tobacco, nicotine, or alcohol. Why are they called gateway? Because they may pave adolescents' way to harder drugs, as I had already mentioned. So, and it could be data about, adolescents' risk-taking or engagement in consumption of harder drugs also. But if you look at, for example, Global Youth Tobacco Survey, which is a multi-country survey, what does it say in terms of findings about India? It reveals that 22% of boys and 10.3% of girls are users of tobacco, right? And this is both smoking as well as non-smoking use of tobacco. Now, if you look at the NFHS data about the percentage of girls and boys who consume alcohol, you will find that between the age group of 15 to 19 years, 1% women and 11% men are consuming alcohol. But if you look at a slightly higher age group, 20 to 24, you can see that the percentage of women consuming alcohol has slightly increased, but the percentage of men who actually consume alcohol has increased more than 2 times. We all know that alcohol is somewhere also associated with performance of masculinity. It is also associated with traditional ideas of being cool, fitting into peers, socializing, and being very, very powerful, autonomous. and therefore you will find a greater prevalence amongst men because it is associated with ideas of masculinity. It's also got to do with access, higher social norms, accepting men's drinking as compared to women. But if you look at what are the correlates, the prevalence, particularly of consumption of substances, is higher among men, particularly those who are ever married, and also amongst men who are school dropouts, right? So substances is a very, very clear example. I mean, substance consumption is a very clear example of adolescents' engagement in risky behavior. Another act of risky behavior which adolescents engage in is violence. Right? And if you look at the definition, here, for example, WHO definition only talks about physical violence, but we are all aware that violence may assume several forms, including emotional, verbal, even economic, reproductive, and sexual. Right? So violence is not just about what you do, but even a threat of doing also constitutes as violence, and it could be against a person or against a group or a community. It can cause harm or it can cause deprivation, and sometimes in some cases it can cause injury or death also. Violence involves both things, commission and omission. Commission means that you are causing something, causing an injury, causing a verbal abuse. You are doing something in order to, inflict violence upon the other person. Omission means you are withholding something. You are depriving the person of the person's need and thereby causing harm or violence also. Right? So interpersonal violence amongst youth is a very, very common phenomenon, and it may range, be situated on a continuum ranging from bullying to even something as grave and serious as homicide also. Violence amongst young people is particularly a gender asymmetrical phenomenon. By that, what I mean is largely initiated by men against women. This is not to say that women are incapable of initiating violence against men, but it is largely initiated. And the forms of violence that women initiate are also different and less severe as compared to men. If you look at again NFHS data, you can find that 27% of married young females, and all of us are aware of the fact that largely, despite the legal age for women being 18, many girls are married at a younger age than 18. And you can find that 27% of married young females experience physical, sexual, or emotional violence by their spouse, right? And NFHS actually asked for this data in the last 12 months, which means they have experienced this in a recent past. Studies also show that even students experience violence, or they may engage in violence, injuries, or threatening others. In today's era, apart from a face-to-face or interpersonal violence, violence also is digitally transacted. Yeah? Digital mediums is another site where you can see growing incidence of violence actually. Right? So the India Internet Report talks about 2 in 3 internet users in India are actually between the age group of 12 to 29. Yeah? And many of them actually talk about experiences of cyberbullying, yeah, or cyber violence. How do you define it? Simply put, harassment through digital devices could be any, and it could happen over social media or chat rooms or gambling platforms. Yeah? And it could range from harassment to even exploitation or assault or public humiliation. It can assume several forms also. Right? Cases of cyber stalking or bullying of women and children have increased by 36% between 2017 and 2018, according to the National Crime Record Bureau. But very interestingly, the conviction rate has actually gone down. So which means actually the crime is occurring, but the punishment is not in proportion to the crime. Right? The CRY study, which is a very recent study, 2020 study, which is conducted amongst adolescents in youth and youth in Delhi, actually talks about around 9.2% of adolescents talking about cyberbullying, and half of them had not reported it to teachers or significant adults in their lives. Yeah? This means that adolescents are exposed to increased digital life, And this digital life is not necessarily safe. They are experiencing or engaging in risky behaviors. They are recipients or perhaps initiators of those risky behaviors. And it is causing a lot of harm. It is causing a lot of negative consequences. But they are not talking about it. They are not reporting. Yeah. Uh, there are several factors which are actually sort of creating a fertile ground for digital space as an unsafe space. Yeah, the first one is there is a naturalization of common sort of violence on social media, which is very commonly occurring. The anonymity which is provided by the digital medium takes away the empathy, the human presence, and also gives permission for engaging in risky behaviors. And the anonymity also creates a very orchestrated calculation of who are the subgroups of adolescents who are easily vulnerable and can fall prey to digital attacks. Right? So this is another risky behavior that adolescents are either recipients of or initiators of. Moving on to the next risky behavior, sexuality. Right? So adolescents, whether we like it or whether we accept it or not, adolescents are engaging in sexually risky behaviors. Sexuality for the longest time has been taboo in India. Many adults believe that talking to adolescents about sexuality will actually promote sexual experimentation. Data exactly points in a contradictory direction. It says that if adults talk about sexuality in a positive, affirmative, and scientific way, adolescents may or may not engage in sexual experimentation, but they will do so in a very, very safe, consensual, and positive manner. And they will develop a positive, affirmative idea of their bodies and their sexuality. But since that's not necessarily the case, adolescents in India are engaging in many risky behaviors. And let's look at the range of risky behaviors. And it's important for us as teachers, as adults, to know what are those. So it could be unprotected intercourse without use of condom, or it could be oral sex or anal sex without, again, using protection. And it could be with multiple partners and not necessarily with a long-term monogamous kind of a partner or a relationship. It could be having sex with high-risk partner who has multiple partners or who has a very high vulnerability of developing STIs or other infections. It could be exchange of sex for money, and which could or may involve exploitation also. And having a partner who injects or has ever injected drugs. So all of these sexual behaviors are talked as risky behaviors, right? So, despite strict norms prohibiting premarital opposite sex mixing, many of us believe that it's all Western and it doesn't happen in India. Data is far, illuminating and points in a very, very opposite direction. Right? So 21 to 23, and this is a IIPS Pop Council 2010 data, and it's quite far comprehensive and like a wide data. It tells us that 21 to 23% of young men and women have received or made some kind of a proposal. 19% men and 9% of women reported that they had been involved in some kind of a romantic relationship, which may involve sexual relationship, and it's largely hidden from parents but known to peers, right? I have already talked about how peers become very important, sort of a social world for adolescents, and many of these reported physical and sexual intimacy. Yeah? If you look at the gender patterns of sexual activity, young men tend to initiate premarital sex much earlier than young women. Obviously, men are far more permitted to engage in sexual behaviors given the social norms or the sexual norms. Uh, Youth in rural areas tend to initiate premarital sexual activity much earlier than their urban counterparts. And as age increases, the sexual activity also increases. Young men report that they have had sex with married women, women in sex work also, and some of it may involve very, very, sexual relationships in very, very unsafe, unprotected ways also. NFHS data also sort of reaffirms what I have already talked about. So far we have talked about how young individuals are engaging in several risky behaviors, road accidents or violence or substance abuse, including perhaps violence in cyber spaces or digital spaces, and engagement in risky sexual behaviors, right? And the last risky behavior that I'm going to talk about, which is, I think, the World Suicide Prevention Day just, was a few days back. And it is very important to talk about this risky behavior that adolescents are engaging in. Suicide is, and we need to distinguish amongst different shades of this risky behavior. Suicide is an act that adolescents or young people may engage in with an intent to end their life. Yeah? Suicidal attempt actually is an act that adolescents may engage in order to perhaps, again, end their life, but it may or may not result in the expected kind of a goal. Self-harm, on the other end, is very different from suicide or suicidal attempt. Self-harm, and many adolescents today are engaging in self-harm. This may involve actually cutting behaviors, or burning their wrists, or banging their head, or depriving themselves of food, or engaging in deliberate acts which may cause harm to their bodies or minds also. The purpose or the goal here is not to end life. The purpose or the goal could be multifold. Again, it is to get something or to get out of something. It could be to reach out to other adults. It could be a communication. It could be a cry for help. It could be to seek attention. But it is also to get out of something. It is also to get out of painful, aversive, depressive, anxiety provoking experiences that adolescents often find very difficult to deal with because of inability to regulate their emotions, or dearth of support systems or spaces where they can talk about some of these painful experiences. So this is the latest NCRB data, and you can see that uh, amongst the suicides which are reported, 18 to 30 age group is the most vulnerable group, and some of the reasons why young people are engaging, unlike Western cultures or Western data, which talks about adolescents and young people engaging in suicidal behaviors or self-harm behaviors for reasons of mental illnesses or emotional problems, adolescents and youth in India particularly engage in these behaviors for socio-cultural or economic or familial reasons. Yeah? And that's a big difference between the Western data, particularly North American and European data, and Indian data. And you can see some of the reasons being family problems or failures in examinations. There are gender differences also in means which are used, as well as the reasons. So if you look at women's reasons of engaging in these acts, they are largely relational. They are triggered by relational conflicts, domestic violence, or some kind of gender discrimination. If you look at men's or boys' reasons, they are related to performance, masculinity, achievement. Whenever they are not able to hold up to those standards, that serves as a very, very powerful trigger. In terms of even acts, far more number of girls or women actually attempt, and far more number of boys or men complete suicides. The means which are used by women are largely accessed from their immediate surroundings. Yeah? But for men, they actually engage in far more lethal kind of means, which may actually lead to very, very harmful consequences, and sometimes actually may result in ending their lives.